Hi, friends. It's December 3rd. The story that I'm going to tell you today occurred in 1914, and there's actually a pretty good video description of what happened because this is a popular story. I'll be posting that along with this video. But our story takes place on the land in between World War I trenches, and English troops on one side and German troops on the other. And one thing that we need to understand about World War I to understand this story is how incredibly miserable it was to fight that war. Now, all wars are miserable, but new technology made this war far worse than the ones that had occurred previously. And we see remnants of that. We see remnants in the ways that we report the news, that warfare is done today. We even have remnants of it in our language. For example, okay. If we tell somebody, hey, we're okay, that means we are all right. But originally, okay wasn't okay, it was zero K. You as a person who was concerned would be looking at a newspaper about the men in your village who were all fighting, and you would see zero K. That meant zero killed. It meant everything was all right. Everything was okay. No man's land, you and I might refer to it now just as a place we didn't want to be. Hey, I was out in no man's land. But what it meant in World War I is that was the land that people shot over at the trenches. If you were in no man's land, it was not a good place to be because you very well could get shot. You and I might say, if someone was being stubborn, hey, they're just digging in. But in World War I, that was a very literal thing. You dug in your position so that you can hold it, so that you could be stubborn. There's other cases, there are other things that were perhaps a little more sinister. You and I, we might say somebody's just being a basket case. In other words, they've lost their composure. But in World War I, that was an ugly thing. It meant that someone had been dismembered and in the shelling, and that they had to be collected in a basket. And all of this to say how miserable the experience was. Other words in our language are left over from that war. Chat, dingbat, cushy. If you got wounded and it was not a big wound, you got sent to the back and you got a cushy job. Funk, pipsqueak, cooties, all these words are remnants from World War I, and just expressing how miserable the entire thing was. And the part of the reason was because the technology changed. World War I saw the first wide use of barbed wire, the first wide use of machine guns, of airplanes, of tanks, of chemical warfare on a scale that was so bad that it spurred all of the treaties against chemical warfare today. It was by far the most destructive war up until that time. There was between 14 and 19 million dead by the end of it. And so, again, the point of all this, saying all this, is that for the average soldier, it was utterly miserable. Mud, cold, disease, and it was deadly. It was quite hopeless, honestly. Peter Jackson has a wonderful documentary about this called They Shall Not Grow Old. I recommend it. But it's really hard in a video like this to convey the misery that those soldiers had to go through day by day. But here's the wonderful thing. On Christmas Day in 1914, that changed for a single day. It began the night before, on Christmas Eve in 1914. The German soldiers began singing that song, Silent Night. Now, you might recall from one of our earlier stories that a Prussian king, and Prussia is part of Germany, had declared that Silent Night was going to be sung every Christmas Eve, everywhere in his lands, from as long as he made it a law. Now, the Prussian king was long gone, but that had become a tradition in Germany, and so these German troops were honoring it. They were singing Silent Night in their trenches. And the English heard it. And the English, you might recall, they knew the song because it had ended up in the United States, got translated, and the song just became incredibly popular. And so the English, they started to sing Silent Night as well. And so the Germans and the English began kind of serenading one another. The next day, Christmas Day, there was no shots at the beginning of the morning, as perhaps was usual, and a few very daring soldiers cautiously and carefully went across no man's land and exchanged some things, tea for chocolate or for tobacco. And soon more and more soldiers began to go into no man's land unarmed, and an unofficial truce began to kind of break out. Men of both sides began to exchange souvenirs, doing things that are very difficult to do in trench, like playing soccer, and no one shot anyone on those sections of the line. Bruce Barnes' father, a soldier, wrote this: "I wouldn't have missed that unique and weird Christmas day for anything. I spotted a German officer, some sort of lieutenant, I think, and being a bit of collector, I intimated to him that I took a fancy to some of his buttons. I brought out my wire clippers and with a few snips removed a couple of his buttons and put them in my pocket. Then I gave him 2 of mine in exchange. I saw one of my machine gunners, who was a bit of an amateur barber in civilian life, cutting the unnaturally long hair of a docile German who was patiently kneeling on the ground while the automatic clippers crept up on the back of his neck." Captain Robert Miles wrote this: "We are having the most extraordinary Christmas day imaginable. A sort of unarranged and quite unauthorized but perfectly understood and scrupulously observed truce exists between us and our friends in the front. The thing started last night, a bitter cold night with white frost. Soon after dusk, when the Germans started shouting 'Merry Christmas, Englishmen,' to us, of course, our fellows shouted back, and presently large numbers on both sides left their trenches unarmed and met in the shot-riddled no man's land between the lines. Here the agreement, all on their own, came to be that we should not fire at each other until after midnight tonight. All the men were fraternizing in the middle and swapped cigarettes and lies in the utmost good fellowship. Not a shot was fired all night." A German lieutenant, Johann Niemann, wrote, "I grabbed my binoculars and looking cautiously over the parapet saw an incredible sight of our soldiers exchanging cigarettes, schnapps, and chocolate with the enemy." In all, about 100,000 soldiers had a reprieve that Christmas Day from one of the worst wars in all of history, because a certain baby had been born in Bethlehem 1900 years before. Grace and peace to you, my friends, and don't forget the important things this season. Take care.